Hi everyone, this is Gavin Lewis, and I am going to offer you an understanding, or at least a depiction, of the story, The Warning, from our class. Um, why did I choose my sections for illustration? Simple. These frames reflect two of the most critical aspects of storytelling in general, introduction and climax. In the intro, our main character, Ronnie, and the thematic or scripted conflict that he faces being called into Mr. Burns's office forms our introduction. For example, you can see here. I'll zoom in a little bit. I know it's backwards there, but you can see Ronnie driving in past the security desk saying hi and waving. That is a clear, a bow to the introduction. In the climax, we get him actually going into Mr. Burns' office, as well as the precursory emotional anxiety our protagonist feels when faced with this conflict. I chose to focus on the most obvious and necessary parts of the story. Again, going back to frame one. Now here's Ronnie, and Ronnie's pulling into work, going past the security guard. An obvious introductory illustration from the story, right? And so then we move on to section two. Here we go. Uh, and I'll back out a little bit. Ronnie going into his office and finding the note on his desk from Mr. Burns. You can see the little note right there, by his lamp. Um, Ronnie going to his office and finding a note on his desk from Mr. Burns. I chose to omit. I chose to leave out. I chose to omit an illustration of Ronnie going down the hallway and speaking to the receptionist because I felt such an action superfluous. And I also felt that that part of the story is also somewhat unnecessary and betrays the climactic buildup for the reader, in my opinion. Him walking down the hall having this conversation with the receptionist, it takes away the buildup builds back down at that point in time. And so instead, I chose to focus on the anxiety-filled climax. Going back, here's the letter. I do a good depiction. I try to do a good depiction of Ronnie picking up the letter from his desk. All right, but from there, I move on to show Ronnie actually waiting in the reception area. There's no long walk down the hallway, and instead I chose to focus on his anxiety. Look at the arrows pointing to his head. He's got his hands clasped. He's sitting on the couch. And more importantly, as we zoom in here, I'm hoping you can see that here. We have the sweat balls coming off of Ronnie, him looking down at his watch there. With only 10 minutes, with a question mark and exclamation point. Only 10 minutes. I chose to focus on that because that's emotional and that's climactic. And I feel that for the listener or the reader at that point, that is the most important thing to convey, not necessarily the minute details of the story, but mostly focusing on the themes and the way the story plays out. And again, here, the final climax, or we reach our climax with Ronnie going hat in hand. So you see, he's finally taking his hat off here. He's had his hat on for the entire story for the most part. You see his hair, and he's, hello, Mr. Burns. Do you want to see me? And so that's, I know it's backwards from the camera, but I will upload them for you to see what they look like. Instead, I chose to focus on the anxiety-filled climax with my final set of illustrations depicting what I believe the author, what I believe the reader, the listener, can identify as fear without taking away the audience's, the reader, the listener's ability to foreshadow who Mr. Burns is or his importance to Ronnie and the story. And also, I feel that with the illustrations, that, in helping to tell the story, that we don't betray, that we don't let down those emotional connections that we get from reading. If a student, if a language capable student were sitting there reading that story unabated, they would feel a certain range of emotions. The illustrations are there to help convey that emotion, to convey that reality. If they don't do that, then they can actually offer a bit more confusion than they're worth. So rather than focusing on things like keys or walking down a hallway or a couple of lines of a conversation with a receptionist, or even a bunch of wordplay, focus on those things that will bring the reader into the story anyway. When you go and you sit and you watch a movie and you pay $14 for a movie ticket, you're not there, to watch this movie so that you can see the main protagonist have a conversation with the receptionist. Many times they will skip that part. Even if it's in the book, they may skip that part in the movie because it takes away, it's anticlimactic. So, and again, that's pretty much the reason why, I chose to focus on illustrations I did. Mostly because, they focus on those main story components: introduction, main character, climax. To get to resolve, we would have had to have drawn more. I would have needed more frames, and I wanted to stay within the parameters of the assignment. But focusing on things like the type of wheels that that Ronnie was driving on his car, or the conversation he may have had with the security guard, or the keys he had in his hand, or the type of watch he was looking at, or anything like that. Focus on those things that if you couldn't read this, you had to have it read to you, and you had to have these pictures, given to you to follow this story. Then you would be able to follow that story just like a 5 or 4 year old, or a speech language deficient student would have to follow that story. And not worry so much about the minute details, and focus more on, how are we going to take this student from point A to point B using an illustrated roadmap.